Facebook Journalism Project Hackathon. One of the key parts of the Facebook Journalism Project is bringing together the news industry with engineers, product developers from Facebook so that they can build things together very early in the development process.
Today, the journalism industry faces many challenges. So we're introducing the Google News Initiative, our effort to enable journalism to thrive in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do.
Welcome to the very first Facebook Journalism Project Hackathon. One of the key parts of the Facebook Journalism Project is bringing together the news industry with engineers, product developers from Facebook so that they can build things together very early in the development process.
Today, the journalism industry faces many challenges. So we're introducing the Google News Initiative, our effort to enable journalism to thrive in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do.
Yes, hi. Does anyone have a watch, actually?
What?
Shit. I know. Does anyone have a phone that I could look at the time from time to time? You don't have a Sorry? I don't actually have a watch. Do you want my phone? I have my own phone.
Oh, always.
Do you want?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Great. Okay, thank you all very much for, does that sound okay? Yeah. Thank you all very much for coming here this afternoon for this talk on the hidden frontline, the threats against investigative journalists. And my name is Mary O'Shea. I'm head of programs at the Rory Peck Trust, a London-based organisation that supports freelance journalists. We work globally. And the reason for today's panel is basically it's grounded in the logic that when we talk about the safety of investigative journalists, we need a switch in the mindset of what actually constitutes a hostile environment. So just by way of introduction, 2018 is the worst year on record for attacks against journalists. But perhaps actually the more interesting statistic is that in recent years, the number of journalists who have been killed outside of zones experiencing conflict has actually been greater. And this marks a very worrying development, because what it means is that journalists are not being caught in the crossfire, or they're actually being directly targeted for the work they do. So far this year, 6 journalists have been killed, 5 of whom were directly targeted. And the thing about a war zone, within reason, is that you know where the front line is. Whereas when the front line is hidden, the threats are obviously much more insidious. Investigative journalists, as watchdogs of public interest, are lined up along this hidden front line. And freelance investigative journalists are obviously particularly vulnerable, working oftentimes alone in very challenging contexts on sensitive stories, without the institutional backing, without legal support, oftentimes without insurance, without equipment. So today we just wanted to talk through some of the threats that investigative freelance journalists are facing. And we have some fantastic panelists today, and all bringing very different perspectives, which I think is usually a very positive thing. On my left, we have Safa al-Ahmad, who is an award-winning freelance documentary filmmaker who works mostly in the Middle East. And she is also a board member of the Frontline Freelance Register, and I'm sure she'll tell you more about that a little bit later. Immediately to my right, we have Andalusia Knoll Soloff, who is a freelance multi-platform journalist who's been living and working in Mexico for the past 8 years, and is also co-coordinator of the Frontline Freelance Mexico, which is the local chapter of FFR in Mexico, which launched 2 weeks ago, I believe. Yeah. And then to my far right, we have Laurent Richard, who is founder and director of Forbidden Stories, and I believe known to many of you here. So, we obviously have limited time. I want to allow time for Q&A towards the end. So I'm actually just going to completely crack on with the questions. First, Laurent, I'm going to come to you, actually, because something you have mentioned before that I found quite interesting is the idea that collaboration is, in fact, the best protection for investigative journalists. And it obviously links to the work that you've been doing in terms of setting up Forbidden Stories. But I would just be sort of really interested to hear why you believe this to be the case.
Well, collaboration can bring protection. I'm not sure if it's the best protection, because protection means many things on the physical threats, physical aspect, but also for protecting the stories, protecting the communication. When we look in some collaboration, recent collaboration, when you look at the Panama Papers, who were coordinated by the ICAJ, I think it was a very smart idea for Bastian Obermeyer and Frédéric Obermeyer to share the leak with more than 300 journalists, because it was obviously that it was dangerous for them to stay alone with that kind of level of information about organized crime, about people close to Vladimir Putin. It was, I think, interesting to share this kind of leak with many, even in terms of protection, of course. When you look at the Khadija project, who was done by OCCRP, Khadija was in jail in Azerbaijan, and they were continuing the work of Khadija. And of course, that kind of collaboration brings protection and pressure in Azerbaijan, and eventually she was released from jail. When we did the Daphne project, we did that because we wanted to continue the work of Daphne. She was investigating money laundering, organized crime, corruption, and by shedding the light of what the killers wanted to hide, it's also a way for dissuading people or enemies of the free press to make any kind of bad attempt against journalists, because the crime you wanted to hide in Baku or in Malta, we will expose it in New York, in Paris, in Nairobi, in many places. So I think that if we do protect the stories, we can protect also the journalists, the because journalists get killed because of the story they will publish or they just recently published.
So in a sense, by not allowing them to kill the story and sort of amplifying the story in a sense, it obviously sends a very strong message. But in terms of, let's say, the networks, if I'm not mistaken, the Daphne Project was 45 journalists working on that?
Yeah, 45 journalists, 18 news organization. Of course, it's when you are, the more people you have on board with that kind of project, the more risk you have of letting the people you are investing know about your investigation. The more communications you have, it's more risk for the investigation and from some whistleblower or for some sources. So you need to move very carefully when you are a group like this. But when we look at the profile of journalists who have been killed, like Daphne or in other places, most of the time they feel they were isolated. So I think it's that's in that way where we can bring protection by continuing the work and by dissuading and by sending that strong signal to enemies of the free press that even if you try to kill the messenger, you will never kill the message.
So it's quite interesting because actually, Safa, you have exactly the opposite view, and it's interesting that you mentioned journalists feeling isolated. For you, you find that for you to be able to work safely, it's better for you to...
I mean, isolation is key, and I understand completely the feeling of isolation, but I think the difference between how I look at my work and yours, I think, is fundamentally how and where you operate. So if you are on the ground investigating a story, it's very different if you are anywhere in the world globally, like with the Paradise Papers or any of the leaked documents. They're documents that you're investigating and not an actual physical space. And so, for example, for me, working in the Middle East, specifically on Yemen or Saudi Arabia, isolation is key as protection, right? Because you might have, even as a global team, you have a very clear understanding of digital security and how every person involved understands their exposure, right? When you're working on the ground on, for example, in a war zone like in Yemen, my concept of security and the people I work with on the ground's concept of security are very different. Yeah. And so you need to isolate yourself quite deliberately. For example, when I work and I don't stay in hotels. I stay in safe houses. I don't use my passport. So you literally have to disappear when you're on the ground because that is the only way for you to survive the investigation. So I think that protection is, collaboration is key for you from that stage, right? But there are different stages of investigative journalism that when you're working on a story, you have to be cognizant of what level of groundwork. For example, Khadija in Azerbaijan, I'm sure when she was working on the ground, she must have needed to be isolated. So then the people around her, you don't know who is going to be an informer, who's going to be telling the government what we're working on, where she is. And so there are fundamental differences in the layers of where you are in an investigation. And if you work on the ground, then I think you have to be super paranoid. And I think that is a part of, we're going to talk later about the mental health challenges of long-term investigations, but you have to be cognizant also of the people that are working with you on the ground. What are you going to tell them? How are you moving? Even your driver can inform on you. So at that level, isolation is actually a good thing and not a bad thing.
I can agree more than that because we exactly do the same thing because when we are collaborating, collaboration means creating a connection. It doesn't mean sending a minivan, a minibus of 10 reporters, and
that would be bad.
So it would be a mistake. So, but we do exactly this way that we are working with reporters who are clearly under the radar in some countries, but we are connected with them. Yeah. I think the most important thing is creating the conversation before and after, because when you look at journalists who get killed, most of the time. They were publishing alone on Facebook. They didn't have any more editors-in-chief because the newspaper were closed because of so many killings before, and no one wanted to take the risk of publishing that stories of these journalists. And so it's important to reconnect journalists together because if we are protecting the information, we can clearly
ironically,
dissuade.
We have to, I think, kind of work like a secret political cell. when we're underground, right? And so each cell doesn't know what the other cell is doing in
Yeah,
a way, but we're
that's
all working towards a main goal.
Yeah.
But we need to be quite careful about what we share and what we say to each other.
The key thing is rules, actually. It's the rules of confidentiality during the collaboration, the rules of at some point you need to stay under the radar, and at some point you need to ask the question to the people you're investigating, and so to appear on the radar.
Yes.
And so this is really a decision process. You need to decide on
and
a
the
collaborative.
stages of it, right? Like
Yes.
at what stage of your investigation do you say, okay, I'm going to now get in touch with the government and tell them
Yeah.
I have X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you decide that based on safety question.
Yeah.
At what is the safest time, the best time to clearly appear, and who will appear in the behalf of the group, and what about the sources at the time you will decide to appear. So I do agree with that.
But I think it's an interesting. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because, in a sense, collaboration poses its own challenges in terms of communications, and obviously with the journalists increasingly under surveillance, this kind of idea of how you keep yourself safe. And I think
But
often.
can I just,
Please.
to follow up on that, privilege, right? And so people who live in the West who don't have a concept of safety and security, I will not name a certain very huge broadcaster, and this person has absolutely no concept of how dangerous it is in the Middle East to share certain stories, right? And so this person emailed 5 other people, CCing me and having a discussion about an investigation I'm working on, with absolutely no concept of how she's endangered me by putting all these other people on the email. But it wasn't out of malice. It was just complete ineptness and the privilege of her own safety, and she didn't even worry about mine. And so that's part of my worry of collaboration, when you're dealing with people that should know better when it comes to safety and confidentiality, but because they live on a different planet, basically, than me, and then they don't understand when you get upset at them. And so that's part of the challenge of constantly having that communication of be more aware of how you're endangering other people, because that may be not your security profile, but you have to be aware of other people's security profile.
I think what's oftentimes interesting in terms of digital security, it's spoken about somewhat in isolation, but obviously there are really significant and direct implications for having poor digital security in terms of your physical safety. I'm conscious of Paul Conroy being here as well, and this idea of people being targeted because you can, follow the trail, so to speak, is something that is very important. But I know, Andalusia, I wanted to bring you in here because I know that you wanted to talk a little bit about the collaboration in Mexico between journalists, and because you're gathering groups of freelance journalists as part of this initiative.
So we just launched 2 weeks ago, Frontline Freelance Mexico, and we have 60 members from all across the country, some of the most dangerous states in Mexico that have the highest rates of aggressions and assassinations. But I do actually think collaboration is essential in Mexico and on the ground. I myself have joined with other groups of journalists when a massacre occurs, which very unfortunately occur frequently in Mexico, and when we find out that there's a massacre occurring, it would be very dangerous for myself just to go as a journalist and arrive to be the first person on the scene of the massacre. So often we do collaborate. 2 years ago there was a federal police opened fire on a teachers' protest and killed 8 people in a small isolated town, and 10 of us did travel there together, and we have actually seen the opposite. What happens when journalists do arrive on the scene without the backing of other colleagues? In 2014, there was a journalist, Goyo Jimenez, in the state of Veracruz, which is one of the most dangerous states for journalists, and he was investigating. He was a local journalist who was paid $1 for every article that he turned in, and lived, in a very, very humble house, supporting his family between numerous jobs working for media outlets and other things to get by. And he was investigating a local kidnapping ring, and was kidnapped from his house by 5 people and disappeared and then killed. And this is, and in analysis of this, while no one, unfortunately in Mexico, 99% of journalism murders go uninvestigated or unsolved, so we can never know exactly the reason that they were murdered or who murdered them. But in analysis of his murder, one of the things that people pointed out was that it was possibly because he was the only journalist in this area investigating this ring of kidnappings. So from there, many local journalists in that area said they will never go to investigate something on their own, that they will always go in group because they're concerned that then they will be targeted.
So they diffuse the risk, so to speak. I mean, and the point you raise in terms of impunity, I mean, journalists will continue to be targeted as long as the attackers get away with it. So impunity obviously is a key issue in Mexico. I want to move on because I think an area that maybe is not discussed enough is the psychological toll of freelancing on many levels. Obviously, there's the concerns for physical safety. There's the stress of working perhaps on very sensitive stories, how to protect your sources. There's kind of the idea of coming under surveillance, being paranoid, being not paranoid enough. All vicarious trauma, moral injury. And not least to mention just the day-to-day stress of making ends meet as a freelancer. So I guess I'd like also, I think, probably maybe the sense of safety before it felt like something far away, whereas now people feel under threat, sitting at home in their living rooms behind their laptops. And that really, really takes a toll. Laurent, I might pull you in here in the sense, because you've been working with a lot of investigative journalists across Europe. And I'm just wondering in terms, because I know you also personally, when you were working in Paris a number of years ago, you were working on the same floor of the building, office building as Charlie Hebdo. So in a sense, this idea of journalists coming under attack and feeling insecure, is that something that, obviously, personally, you've seen that happen, but also just in terms of the networks of investigative journalists that you're interacting with, do you see it taking a psychological toll?
Yeah. Well, just back to what happened in Paris, and it was one of the reasons I created Forbidden Stories, that I used to spend a lot of time covering conflict or doing documentaries for 20 years in dangerous zone, and so I was really used to see violence or to film violence, and never used to see that in my own environment, in my offices, and seeing colleagues dying in front of me after that killing of Charlie Hebdo. So, but yeah, I think the idea of the danger of the threats, whether you are behind your computer or on the field, it's a constant feel that we have, of course, and especially on the. I don't know if we can talk about the digital, if you want to talk about this, but yeah, it's, and we were talking about paranoia. We need to be a bit paranoid, I think, and much more than we are currently. I think that's one of the biggest challenge now we are facing is really the spying part of spyware, and how to protect information and how we are communicating safely. And when you were mentioning the case of when the key thing is what we call the first contact issue, when someone is contacting you, say, I want to work with you on this story, or I know that you are working on this story, but by saying this in this email is endanger you, but your sources and 10 other people, and that's a nightmare. And so that's really something regarding the fear and the threats regarding journalists, I think we really need education on this. And especially on the first contact. So that's why with our group we are using some tools we know are open sources. But we need to keep in mind that there is nothing 100% sure. And once you know that, you can act differently. And yeah.
I mean, I think also, what's quite stressful is oneself. You can take every security risk. You can be, super, super cautious. But you're only as safe as the people that you're interacting with. Yeah. And I think that's something that, particularly in your region.
Yeah. If I can
of
follow
course,
up on
absolutely.
What you were saying about the threat, it is psychologically very different because I cover the Middle East and other countries, and you see all the violence, and you see hundreds of people dead and stuff, and it doesn't impact you as much as when you're working in your own home. And emotionally, it felt very different. For example, I avoided working on Saudi Arabia for a very, very long time. And then it came to a point where I did do a documentary there. The kind of fear and the seeing your own country fall apart and having being cognizant that what you do will directly impact the safety and security of your family is a very different thing when you fly out to a different country and you cover, and I'm not saying there isn't empathy and fear and stuff like that when you do those stories, but then when you, I think a lot of commissioners don't actually understand the fear, the constant fear, if you're a local journalist doing local stories. And so the threat and the fear doesn't end when you finish your story. It is constantly there. And I find, sorry, I'm going to go back to the word privilege of the people who commission stories and they don't fully understand the dangers of what local journalists have to face after everybody else is gone, and the emotional toll that takes when you don't know, like we were talking yesterday, most of these journalists get killed in front of their kids, in front of their families. That is something that no commissioner will have an understanding of if they're somewhere in London or New York commissioning the story in the Middle East or in Mexico. And I think that emotional toll is, I think, harder to put your finger on how damaging that actually is in the long term. Of course, yeah. And especially with investigations when you're not actually dealing with a front line. To me, I would much rather deal with a clear front line when I know who's shooting at who and who's my what line am I on and who's trying to kill me. But then when you're doing investigations, the threat is so much wider than that. And especially when you were saying about like who communicates with you as well. It's like I thought I was, when I did the Saudi story, I thought I was being super, super careful. But the people that I contacted weren't as careful because the digital security aspect, who they tell, sometimes they just love saying, oh, I saw a journalist. I'm like, no, don't fucking say that. Like, you know, but like there's a different way of understanding the threat measures towards them, and things have been changing so fast in the Middle East. So you don't even know what was legal yesterday, all of a sudden isn't legal today, and the lines keep moving. And so it is becoming harder and harder even for me. Like when I finished filming and I left, the anti-terrorism laws hadn't been published. But before I actually went on air, they had been published, and all of it, everything I did became terrorism. And so everybody who was involved with me that understood the risks at the time I was on the ground, that the parameters of what is and what isn't legal completely changed by then. And we had to like completely like take people out. And even now, I mean, they've been taken to court, naming these things. So it is very, very difficult. The duty of care on that level is really complex.
And I think also Mexico, the number of journalists, I mean, there was a study done by Anthony Feinstein, the number of journalists experiencing PTSD in local journalists in Mexico is extraordinarily high.
Right, it's much higher actually than in war zones, as was already mentioned. It's because people, they live in the war zone, you know, and then I think, I mean, I live in Mexico and call it my home, but of course, I do have a US passport and can leave the country. Most people, Mexican journalists that have come under threat and sought asylum in the United States have been detained and eventually deported and returned to the exact same conditions that they fled. And also there is when journalists are threatened, they're often not necessarily concerned about themselves being killed. They're concerned about their families being killed because often the threats are against their families, or especially in the case of women, they're threats of sexual violence or rape. Right. And then the impact of their families in especially the impact of, in Mexico, it's journalists are not just killed, but they're also disappeared, meaning that they're kidnapped and then no one knows. To the date, over the past decade, over 40,000 people have been disappeared, and that means no one knows what has happened to them. There's now all these organizations that have sprouted up of looking in clandestine graves for their family members, and that also includes families of journalists, but there was one journalist, a local journalist, 2 years ago, Daniel Esqueda, and he was kidnapped from his home, and his mother died and then he was killed, and the videos were broadcast of him right before he was killed, and then his mother did die shortly after. And in an interview before she died, she was like, I just can't deal with this. And this happens repeatedly, just that you can never escape the trauma. There was actually Frontline Freelance Mexico was born out of 7 colleagues of mine that were working in the southern state of Guerrero, which is where I work frequently, and it's a very dangerous state. They were all kidnapped while reporting on local, organized crime in the area, and they were detained by 100 armed men and all their material taken away, and also all of their IDs, you know, so there's no, they got out of there alive, but they know that the people that had kidnapped them have their home addresses and only live an hour away. And one of the journalists, I asked him, this I think goes into the next, what we're going to talk about, but one of the journalists, they asked him, I asked him if he got paid for the story that he did, and he goes, how am I going to get paid? I didn't turn the material in. They robbed it from me. And so I think it's that they almost lost their lives, then some also lost their jobs, and then also the fear that they would come after them at their own homes. And just one quick very quick digital surveillance is that in Mexico we have the big problem with Pegasus, with the former administration, where both journalists, lawyers, and activists were being spied on, especially ones that were working on corruption and the intersection of organized crime and the government. And it just was revealed 2 weeks ago that Griselda Triana, who's the widow of renowned journalist Javier Valdez, who was murdered 2 years ago, that the government actually tried to spy on her 2 weeks after he was murdered numerous times, and she did not. They were fortunately not able to get into her phone, but the question is, she said, I would have cooperated with any investigation to find out who had murdered my husband. Why do they need to spy on me? And part of it is because they also want to discredit the journalists and try to show that they were not killed for their line of work, that they were killed for a personal reason, and that's believed possibly that's why they were spying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Safa, you talked earlier, I want to move into sort of the duty of care. In terms of investigative journalism, obviously that not only includes news organizations, but increasingly foundations too. But the idea, and particularly when we talk about trauma and the psychological toll of this type of work, it's not necessarily something that happens it's not linked to an event, it's not something that happens on a particular assignment or when you're like on someone's clock, so to speak, but oftentimes it's the cumulative long-term effects, especially for local freelancers, and just that idea of, like, do you feel that enough is being done to... Okay.
No. I mean, frankly, no.
Yeah,
and I am privileged that I am at a point where I have long-term relationships with the people I've worked with, and even then I don't feel like they do enough. They understand any of the challenges that we really have to go through following up on the family situation. Part of what Saudi, for example, does is not only do they arrest and disappear activists and journalists, they put the family under house arrest. So it's a collective punishment. So, and in a way, yes, they worry about the story, and so there's power to continuing the story, but also there's benefit for them because it's collective fear and punishment for everybody around you. So they make it such a high price to be a journalist, right? And so you have to, on a personal level, you have to decide, do I have the right to endanger my family, right? And then your family turns around and says, you put us in danger, you got us fired, you possibly could get us killed as well, you are endangering our own livelihoods. And so it's not enough to worry about your own story and the duty of care towards the people you're working with, and will you deliver or not, will you be paid or not, will you be able to pay your therapy if you're a therapist for PTSD, trauma, but also involving the dangers towards families now, and all governments know this, that this is the easiest and most powerful way to silence people. And so either you become the asshole who doesn't care what happens to your family, or you isolate yourself from your family, or you try to do what is possible. The variety of traumas that are not just directly related to the story that you're trying to do has become such a high price right now. And so, and I do not feel that there is support, that there is a mechanism to understand the dangers that are going on right now, especially if you're someone who still lives in the place where you cover. I am privileged that I can go in and out, or I'm not privileged because I cannot go in anymore. And so all of those are actually, they're parts of the problem. And so how do you continue to do the work without endangering your family? I think, I don't know what the answer to that is, honestly.
Yeah, probably. I mean, is there one? I mean, I was just talking with a Ukrainian journalist a couple of weeks ago who was had received threats, like a letter with a photograph of a school where her 8-year-old daughter was in school, and saying, you know, if you continue reporting, we will get your daughter. I mean, it's absolutely
and then what do you do with that?
petrifying. Yeah. Andalusia, you mentioned something about like a Mexican journalist receiving $1 for a story that they were working on, which is like just absolutely staggering. Obviously, investigative journalism is high risk and it's also high cost, whereas perhaps a news organization can invest in it as a kind of a, you know, a reputational thing to do when other work will sort of counterbalance the costs. As a freelancer, you obviously don't have that. And particularly because investigative work tends to be so sort of time-consuming and expensive, and not necessarily that the income generated from it is particularly good. I mean, is that fair to say, I think?
We're all making bank.
But I guess, how do you go about it in a way when the income is not so large that it doesn't jeopardize your safety? Like, how do you not cut corners in a way?
I mean, I think for many, unfortunately, they don't actually have that privilege to not cut corners, you know, because many Mexican journalists, and the majority of Mexican journalists that are murdered, last year 9 journalists were murdered, the year before 12 journalists were murdered, and this year there have actually been 6 journalists. We're only on the 3rd month of 2019, and 6 journalists have been murdered in Mexico already this year. So and we have a new president. People had some hope that things would be getting better, but it's just actually getting worse. But anyways, what journalists, the ones that do only make $1 for every article or every photo, that means that they have to go out and report in situations, you know, when someone's saying, oh, maybe that massacre just occurred, or there's a gunfire happening there, you shouldn't go there. They know that their outlet wants them to go there without any protection, and that if they don't go, they're making $2 less, you know, which $2 sounds ridiculous, but it means that then their children don't have food to eat, they can't pay their rent, etc. So, and also the precariousness, one thing that happens frequently with journalists in Mexico is that Mexico City is considered relatively safer than many of the regions where they report, so journalists, and the government does have a protection program where it does at least help journalists get out of the dangerous areas where they're reporting, and they come to live in Mexico City, but they come with no work and they have no income, and many of them, they are away from their families, have no way to get their families to move there, and so then in the end, many of them just say, never mind, what am I doing here? I should just go back, and they go right back to the same dangerous situation that they were in. And actually, last year, numerous journalists that were under this protection program were murdered. So it just shows how the protection program actually is not working at all. I mean, and I think just last week, as part of our launch with Frontline Freelance Mexico, we had 3 days of workshops on being a freelance journalist, and a lot of it was about negotiating and how to charge, et cetera. And one workshop was about being a fixer, and we asked, okay, how many of you have been a fixer before? There were 22 journalists, and some were like, what's a fixer? And then once we explained what a fixer was, everyone was like, I've been a fixer. And then it was like, how many of you have charged to be a fixer? And it was like 5 out of 20, even though 20 had already been a fixer, because they didn't realize that that was something you could charge for. So a lot of it has to do with international journalists also taking advantage of local journalists and their lack of knowledge of knowing that these are things that they could charge for, and that they are just, you know, giving away all their resources and contacts and continuing to make $1 an article.
Probably that journalist is happy not to pay because she has to cut corners because they want to tell the story as well.
Right.
So it's not out of malice necessarily, but everybody's trying to cut corners to do the story.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to move on, because one area that I think is really, really key to talk about with regard to investigative journalism is obviously legal. You know, I opened by talking about, you know, the number of journalists who had been killed, but actually there are many, many ways to silence a journalist, and obviously the risk or the threat of legal action before or after publication is, you know, it can be crippling, especially if you're freelance. Laurent, I know you have direct experience of this. You were, in fact, a case was taken against you by the government of Azerbaijan. And I just would like if you could maybe talk a little bit about that. And I realize at the time you were a staff at Première Ligne.
Yes. Well, I think that's also the one of the key points is that one way of targeting journalists is to sue them and ask them a lot of money to pay if they are facing a trial. And hopefully, I'm French, and I have lawyers, and I was working at that time for a production company, well-known, we have a lot of lawyers, and so that was perfectly fine for us, and we do agree with the fact that journalists can go to the court and can face trial if there is real justice. It's, of course, not the same story in Baku or When you look at Daphne Caruana Galizia, just right before the killing, she were facing 46 libel cases. 46 libel cases. And most of those libel cases were coming from the government. So, and all the bank account of Daphne was frozen. So, and when she were driving the car at the time of the explosion, she was having a meeting with the bank because she was trying to find ways to get some cash and money just to have a living. And so on my side, it was so different. I was in France, I was in Paris. But what was interesting so I did a long story called My President is on Business Trip, and I was following François Hollande, the former French president, and he was, as a French president, going in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, making some contracts, importing oil and gas. And my question of that documentary, it was a 2-hour documentary, was how can you be the president and the leader of a democracy and make a contract, and what about the human rights question, and how do you address this? More than one short statement. And so I was investigating the corruption all around French companies and European companies who were traveling, and the CEO were traveling with the president over there and making contracts. So I was arrested there. I was arrested by the intelligence people in Azerbaijan. I come back to France, and they decided to sue me because I named the country a dictatorship. And so during the documentary, we say, okay, it's a dictatorship because for 4 or 5 reasons. First, there is no real election, and there is a lot of objective reports who can state that. Then there is a kind of kleptocracy on the 3 generations from the very same family. There is journalists in jail, opponents in jail, torture, human rights reports on this. And so,
I mean, it's a brave case to take because it's pretty easy to,
But actually, so they sue me personally, and what was interesting that it was not Ilham Aliyev, the chief of state, it was the state of Azerbaijan, the state itself as a state. So it was the first time in French press history that a state itself. And so there were 2 questions that, is that a dictatorship, yes or no? So that was an interesting trial. And the second question that, can a foreign state can export its censorship abroad? And so finally, we took that trial as an opportunity to make not the trial of defamation, but to make the trial of the dictatorship. Yeah. And so we spent hours explaining why it was a dictatorship. And we asked opponents who were in exile to come and to prove and to explain what was a dictatorship when they were jailed. And so, and we have a lot of coverage, and so I think it was a very silly idea from them to sue us because many stories have been published at that time, and eventually we won. So it's perfectly okay to name them as a dictatorship. So that was a good news, even especially for the Azerbaijani people. Yeah. And it was so stated that a foreign state cannot sue abroad, in France at least. So so that was, but that was a 3-year trial, and it cost a lot of money. But hopefully we were able to pay it, and of course it's very different when you are Khalija Ismailova or the journalists on the ground.
Of course. Safa, I know you also, I mean, when at the time of...
I have, again, the opposite experience of you on the legal stuff.
It's always handy on a panel when you've got completely different, that's why we sort of separated them. Well, yes, no, because you made a film a few years ago on Saudi Arabia, right, for BBC. It was commissioned by BBC. And I would just like to hear a little bit more about that. And how do you operate within this framework? How do you work when there is this threat, especially as a freelancer, of legal action? It can be crippling, right? Yeah,
I mean, and Saudi Arabia has proven that they're beyond borders and have no problem killing people anywhere. But to me, I mean, it's very interesting that you said that the production company supported you. My experience is the complete opposite. So I was in negotiations via production company with Netflix. And within the contract, they wanted to have me get my own insurance, so then in case I get sued for the content that they're going to be airing, that they wouldn't be responsible and I would. And I didn't even get a final cut rights or sit in the room. So it is really, really interesting, actually. This is quite a good production company, because my experience with production companies is completely the opposite. And as FFR, for example, one of the biggest things that we're trying to do is have have a legal template at least. So then as a freelancer, you can say, instead of you signing the contract of the BBC or Netflix or whoever is trying to hire you, you give them a contract and say, this is the contract I am willing to sign as a freelancer, these are my rights, and everybody should be signing on to that. And I think that's part of the problem of freelancers who don't understand their rights in different countries, and now it's so global. So as an American, you don't know what rights you have in Britain or in France or in Mexico, and so it's becoming such a complicated field to navigate your rights within. And especially on the legal stuff. For example, after I did the film for BBC on, it's called Saudi Secret Uprising, about what was happening in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia in 2011. And so the Saudi embassy wrote an official letter to the BBC saying all the crimes I've committed by making this film. And one of the things, as I said, they had just issued new anti-terrorism laws, and so they don't understand the difference between journalism and activism and terrorism, and to them all of it is the same, obviously. And so they considered it a crime to talk to people who were involved in protests. They considered it a crime that I made a film without their permission. And so we're talking about even about timing, because I did most of the secret filming in Saudi Arabia, then left, then asked the Saudi government for a response, because I knew if I asked for their permission inside Saudi Arabia, I would never get it. And so all of these things show, I mean, you are operating within a state that already has a very established legal system, France. I am dealing with countries that don't have, that make a mockery of their judicial system. And so there is absolutely no safety or security. And also you have production companies and media outlets that also have no respect for freelancers, are taking advantage of us as freelancers. So it's not even the $1, it's worse than that. They want to be responsible for nothing in the coverage. They want you to win the awards, they want you to win the Courage Bullshit awards and stuff, but they don't want to actually pay the price for the journalism itself. And that to me is even worse than saying we're not going to pay you a decent fee. We are not even going to be responsible for you legally beforehand. And so they're already, I mean, the contract was also something about, what was the phrase? My image in the universe. They have the right to do whatever they want with it. They want, I'm just like, so I mean, those contracts are a part of the problem of like, how do you protect yourself legally? They already want you to sign it off. How do you protect yourself as your body? I mean, we could go on with this. There's really very little, in my experience, where production companies will not try to sign off any responsibility that they have towards me. Yeah.
Right. Very quickly before we open to questions, I mean, I've had an experience, I think yesterday we were talking about the role that production companies, especially those of us that do work in film or video, that they have the contracts where I recently negotiated a very good contract where my rights were more respected, and then what they did was just also ask me to recommend fixers to work with, and since I was thought I was the producer, I recommended the fixers, and then they didn't want to pay what I had negotiated in my contract, nor my rights, so what they did was go around me and then hire all the fixers and cut me out. So that's what happens when you, real nice. I won't mention it's a very big media outlet, but anyways, so
starts with an N.
Right, but also just on the legal end, of all the attacks on journalists in Mexico, legal is not necessarily one of them, but I do think that, not that there have not been journalists who have been in prison, that has happened, but it does happen much less frequently. But I think the legal issues are more what happens once you're murdered. Regina Martinez, who was an investigative journalist who was murdered, I think 6 years ago, when they started doing the investigation, they determined that it was a passionate murder, meaning that probably from a boyfriend, because she had makeup. Meaning if she had makeup, that meant she dated, and that it wasn't because she investigated massacres by the army, but probably because she maybe went on a date and that some man had killed her because she wore makeup. So, I mean, and that's...
So misogyny is the fault, not dictatorship.
Right, but I'm saying that it's a lot of the, where a state with very... a weak judicial and legal system, but also it's just a lot of the criminalization of the journalists doesn't happen while they're alive and reporting, it happens after their death.
Yeah, but can I say also like Gulf dictatorships, now they're using Interpol so to silence journalists and activists who manage to get out of the country. They are lodging criminal cases against them so that they can take it to Interpol, and then Interpol demands that they get extradited back to the countries. For example, the Bahraini soccer player who was extradited by Australia back to Bahrain.
Thailand. Yeah,
I mean, and so even the institutions that are allegedly supposed to be of protection to us, like with Interpol, and that's a question. I'm quite curious how what Interpol will do about this, if anything.
I'm conscious that we have been eating up a lot of time, and I would like to leave time. No offense. I would like to leave time for some questions from the audience. So, oh, hands up already. Goodness.
Are they listening? Wait, to you, please wait.
Sorry, who's they?
Right now.
Yeah. Okay, here we are all sitting freely listening to you guys talk about the horrors of what being a freelance journalist is all about, and the massive dangers and really the terror that strikes in you. Are they here too? I mean, it is a journalism festival. The people that could be targeting you or doing you harm, are they walking around Perugia as well?
They are here.
Are they seated here? Yeah. I mean, is
Where
the threat
you?
such that they also sort of, sit here and listen to what you say, and perhaps the way you say it, or perhaps what you're revealing about them by your very declarations?
Is your question, are they listening? Then yes, obviously. Right?
I'm sorry?
Yes, obviously.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So they are. So you're very brave to even sit here and come out and say what you're saying. If you are in danger of being heard.
I don't think we've revealed anything that they don't know about themselves.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. So as long as we don't have to be scary, that's all.
Sorry, please, the lady here.
Thank you so much. In terms of the safety issues and these risks and danger, I was wondering why you still exist to be an investigative journalist. What keeps you patient about keeping doing it, even though there's all dangerous issues?
So in terms of what drives them to be investigative journalists?
Yeah. How they keep doing it, even though they know there's issues surrounding it.
Okay.
I think for me, once I have a social justice background before becoming a journalist, being more involved in community organizations and activism, et cetera. And for me, I think it's knowing that there's so much injustice in the world, and especially living in Mexico, a country that I have, has adopted me, and seeing my colleagues have been murdered, my colleagues have been kidnapped. I think it's at that point you can't just abandon it, that it's not just something like, oh no, I'm just gonna now start reporting on music, and although I would like to someday, but no, but I think it's somewhat out of a moral obligation, and I do think that on an emotional level, a lot, myself and many other journalists, when you are witnessing so many injustices all the time, I think at least we feel that we're doing something, that instead of just consuming the news and seeing how horrible things are, that at least our work is having some impact, and hopefully that, we do this to say, okay, I did a documentary on investigations of murders of journalists, and actually we did it saying, okay, we hope that no other journalist is murdered, and then when the day it came out, a journalist was murdered the next day. But we do it. You can't just give up. I think it's having community, being with other journalists, and feeling that we are making an impact with our work.
Safa, I have a hunch you probably have something to say on this. What keeps you going? Why do you do it?
I have no justice illusions. I like pissing off governments, but I think journalism is an accumulative effect, right? I have no illusions that me alone will make a massive impact, and you can't work thinking that. I think that will be a depressing thing when there isn't direct impact. I think we all, hopefully, Paul, you've covered Syria. We've all covered different things that are really, I mean, if you think of it in the short term, you say there's no good that's going to come out of any of this. But I think there is an accumulative effect that's really important. For me personally, I love witnessing history as it unravels. I don't like other people telling me what happened somewhere. I like the curiosity, being able to go somewhere and see it for yourself, and I think that's an amazing privilege, and I can't imagine not doing that. And so you can die crossing the street, really. Like, I mean, life and death are insignificant. I think how you live your life, I think, is more meaningful that way, yeah.
Laurent, anything on that?
Yeah, no, just shortly, I think, yeah, I do agree. It's like a privilege. It's, of course, it could be dangerous, it's like a privilege because you are experimenting a lot of things. You're traveling, you're meeting stories. You are, even if you're not traveling, but just reporting of what happened on society is so important. And we do, when you make the comparison with a society, community where the journalist is dying, you know what democracy can become without journalism. And so, especially in that context where you are far-right party, when you see what's happening in the US, you know what journalism means, and you know how it's useful. At the same time, we really need that kind of festival and that kind of discussion to think about how we can improve things and how we can report better and how we can fight fake news, for instance. But yeah, that's a kind of privilege, and this makes me happy.
Yeah. And I think journalism for dictatorships more even than democracy.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So earlier on, you were mentioning about how there are sometimes contracts which are abusive of nature. And so basically, I just wanted to know, I mean, that was a problem that we all face as freelance journalists, and many a times that happens, especially in countries like, for example, I'm from Pakistan, and over there, the same thing, sort of, the Western publishing houses or production houses come, and then they have these kind of contracts where they want to take all the content, but do not want to, and later on take credit also, but at the time when it's happening. So, I mean, I was just wondering, like, in your experience, have you come across any organization or is there any solution for freelance journalists to sort of, go to some organization and get some protection? I mean, have you looked into this sort of thing, that where you can get a better contract from these Western production houses, or is there someone working on that?
I happen to be a board member of an organization like that.
But so for well.
Yeah.
So can you tell me more about what you're doing there?
This is the challenge of freelance journalists, right? Like, we are isolated in our own very different circles around the world, right? One of the things that we are hoping as FFR, as a frontline freelance register, is to give the platform so then we can understand better the different challenges of freelancers in the different mediums. So television is a bit different than print, than radio, than all of that, right? And photography. And so the idea is how to have a more powerful collective, right, to discuss these things. So as I mentioned, the thing about the contracts and working on these contracts is vital for this. And so if we work together and try to link different freelancers together, so then we can have a stronger voice. The problem with us now is that we are so dispersed, we don't have collective power. And I think the challenge is to have more organizations like FFR and ACOS and Rory Peck that do represent freelancers or support freelancers or advocate for freelancers, because that's where the power comes. If organizations like BBC, Netflix, PBS, all these organizations suddenly realize that we have a collective voice and we are forcing them to respect our work and give us credit and support us when we fall down, when we have PTSD, when we're traumatized, when we need support, when we no longer can work because of injury. I think they're getting away with it because we are not organizing.
Okay, time for...
There was, I think before that, he had us...
Okay, we're going to have two questions. And then we're going to have to wrap up.
Thank you very much. Just I want to ask for journalists who working with human rights issue, if there is line between working as professional journalists and people who believe with principle or case and defense and try to do something for it.
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
The line between your work as believe with some case or the human rights or democracies or else, and the professional line or professional system.
Implying the line between activism and journalism.
Yeah.
Anyone?
I could take it. I mean, I think that is often, there's a criticism, and I personally don't believe in objective journalism, as I think many others don't also, is that every journalist has their own perspective, you know. So for me, I'm always looking for the voices that are not the voice of the voiceless, because I don't believe anyone is voiceless, but I do believe that there are voices that are left out of the media, and especially in Mexico, where there's a lot of government publicity in the media, who is always heard are the politicians. So in my personal work, what I do is look for the voices that are not heard. Who are the people affected by the violence? Who are the people affected by new dams, mining, new highways, and when I go to focus on that voices, that's not activism. I'm just highlighting those voices, and I will never deny that I have a perspective and hope to highlight human rights abuses. But that doesn't make me an activist. That just makes me a journalist focused on human rights abuses.
There was one last question, I think. Or, yeah, sorry, microphone's coming.
I was just wondering how you build and maintain personal relations if you've got the constant paranoia of betrayal, but then equally the kind of pressure that you're going to put them in harm's way and stuff. Like, how do you balance that?
Interesting question. You want to hand that over to you?
Very difficult. Sometimes you have to not communicate. Sometimes you have to communicate, and we both have to understand the risks. There's no easy answer to this. Every story is different, and every exposure is different. And you, I mean, I thought I was protecting someone, for example, and it turned out that I wasn't. And it's just, with digital security, it becomes, governments have unlimited resources to hack everything you own and communicate. And so there's limitations to how much I, as a human being, can limit my communications with others, and they don't take responsibility as well. I might be really safe, they may not be as safe. I have no easy answer for this, and it scares the shit out of me when I do investigation. No, seriously, like, you can't, the guilt after somebody dies, what are you going to do? I mean...
I think, and just to add on this, one of the key questions is the time you have. If you want to go fast, if you want to publish fast, this is exactly how you are doing mistakes.
Yeah.
And if you have the time to speak with your sources, to speak with your contact, with your colleague, with the other investigative, with the fixer, and to think, just the time for you to think about all the consequences the publication will have, whether it's good or negative. And so you need to anticipate everything, which is very challenging and very difficult. But the key issue, the key question is the time you are offering to that decision process about the consequences. And yeah, I think that's critical.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have to wrap up. We're
Getting
actually, exactly, it's 1 p.m., so we're good. Please do check out the work of Frontline Freelance Register and also the Rory Peck Trust, and also particularly the chapter in Mexico of the Frontline
Freelance Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much.
Sarah, can we just get a picture of us standing here? Okay.
Thank you.